I've titled today's talk Caesarean Rhetoric. If you haven't got a chance to watch the other video, Periclean Rhetoric, feel free to go do that. The essential thrust of this series is talking about the role of the trivium in delighting in thought, and rhetoric is one of the main portions of the trivium. We haven't given it a very thorough treatment, so I figured I would try to do as best I could to give us something rather than nothing, because I believe dialectic and the other skills of the trivium are inferred in everything we've done in positive perspectives so far. So the first quotes we will be reading have to do with Caesar the man. Most of them are taken from the foreword to the Gallic Commentary, written by Thomas de Quincey. Based upon my research, he was a British man who also wrote the book Confessions of a British Opium Eater, or something to that effect. Take that for what you will, and that might completely write off everything this fellow has to say, but here we go. Caesar the warrior, quote, that on the breaking out of the civil war, not only did the centurions of every legion maintain a horse soldier, but even the privates volunteered to serve without pay, and what might seem impossible, without their daily rations. So right away, as a warrior, he inspired his troops. So much so that they were willing to follow him without monetary compensation, which later on in the Roman history, that is not something that happens at all. That's something that's complained about from time to time. So Caesar is a statesman. As a statesman, he also was well beloved and mourned when he died, as we see in the following quote, and I believe this is from Tacitus. Or this is De Quincey quoting Tacitus, quote, that all people of foreign nations then residing at Rome distinguished themselves by the conspicuous share which they took in the public mourning, and that beyond all other foreigners the Jews for night after night kept watch and ward about the emperor's grave, unquote. So it's very strange that Tacitus would mention the Jews. Very strange indeed. But that's what he does. Another thing that is mentioned is Caesar as a statesman is his ambition, and De Quincey and others highlight how his ambition was no worse than any other ruler. In fact, he did what he was supposed to do, while the last dying vestiges of the Republic faded into oblivion, because for all intents and purposes, the triumvirate, composed of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, really were in charge of Rome. You could call them the deep state, if you wanted. So, quote, in some cases, ambition is a hopeful virtue. In others, as in the Rome of our resplendent Julius, ambition was the virtue by which any other could flourish. So the Roman idea of virtue is apparently very favorable, and the Roman idea of ambition was even more favorable because it gained you virtue. So they do not necessarily think of Caesar, on all accounts, as this terrible dictator. By no means. And then finally, Caesar as a statesman, this quote sums it up, quote, even Pompey, not by nature of an aspiring term, and prompted to his ambitious course undoubtedly by circumstances and the friends who besieged him, was in the habit of saying, Sulla potuit, ego non potero, which is to say, Sulla found it possible, shall I find it not so? And then we must ask, possible to do what? To overthrow the political system of the Republic. So, Thomas de Quincey gives a favorable impression of Caesar as a statesman and as a warrior. And the capstone to all of this is Caesar as an orator. This is what Thomas Quincey says of Caesar as an orator. Quote, as an orator, Caesar's merit was so eminent that according to the general belief, had he found time to cultivate this exertion, the supposed supremacy of Cicero would have been made questionable. Cicero of the time, another person who's written many books from this Roman Republican time period, was considered more splendid than Caesar in his rhetoric, but a lot of people read the rhetoric of both and some consider Caesar to be better, and some say, hey, this should not even be disputable if Caesar had given it full diligence. But I mean, you can't really blame the guy. He's busy leading legions, conquering provinces, taking over Rome, things like that. So we can forgive him for not polishing his oratorical skill. Continuing on, it also says that, quote, rightly conceiving that everything patriotic was dignified, and that to illustrate or polish his native language was a service of real and paramount patriotism, he composed a work on the grammar and orthopy of the Latin language. Cicero and Caesar were the only Romans of distinction in that age who applied themselves with true patriotism to this task, unquote. So, by and large, Caesar is a warrior, and as a statesman and as an orator, he has the full package. And this is a great quote that summarizes Caesar in comparison to Augustus. Quote, was Caesar, upon the whole, the greatest of men? We restrict the question, of course, to the classes of men great in action, great by the extent of their influence over their social contemporaries, great by throwing open avenues to extended powers that previously had been closed, great by making obstacles once vast become trivial, or prizes that once were trivial to be glorified by expansion. This is another quote. Within the quote, I, said Augustus, found Rome built of brick, but I left it built of marble, unquote. But Gaius Julius, under such a limitation of the comparison, did a thing as much transcending that of Augustus as it was greater to project Rome across the Alps and the Pyrenees, expanding the republic into the provinces of Gallia, Belgium, Batavia, Britannia, Allobroges, Helvetia, and Hispania. All of this is greater than to decorate a street or to found an amphitheater. So, by and large, Caesar is one of those enigmatic figures who is always worth a second, third, and fourth look for the sake of becoming a wiser and more effective individual, and obviously today we will be looking at his oratorical and rhetorical skill. So, where did this all begin? Essentially, he began his rise, in my opinion, in the Gallic Wars, in the Gallic Commentaries. This, many people agree, is where his rise began. He left Rome for the Gallic Wars, an indebted political failure, to some accounts, and he returned a conquering hero. And this fact tilted the balance of power in the triumvirate and led towards civil war in the Roman Republic. Let's listen to the beginning of his commentary. Quote, all Gaul is divided into three parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani the other, those who in their own language are called Celts, in ours Gauls the third. All these differ from each other in language, customs, and laws. The river Garonne separates the Gauls from the Aquitani. The Marne and the Seine separate them from the Belgae. Of all these, the Belgae are the bravest, because they are farthest from civilization and refinement of the province. Merchants least frequently resort to them and import those things which tend to effeminate the mind. And they are the nearest to the Germans, who dwell beyond the Rhine, with whom they are continually waging war, for which reason the Helvetii also surpass the rest of the Gauls in valor, as they contend with the Germans in almost daily battles, when they either repel them from their own territories, or themselves wage war on their frontiers. One part of these, which has been said that the Gauls occupy, takes its beginning at the river Rhine. It is bounded by the river Garonne, the ocean, and the territories of the Belgae. It borders too on the side of the Sequani and the Helvetii, upon the river Rhine, and stretches towards the north. The Belgae rise from the extreme frontier of Gaul, extend to the lower part of the river Rhine, and look towards the north and the rising of the sun. So right away, it's a powerful, powerful statement. And he closes out his introduction with this very poetic closing. Quote, their country extends from the river of Garonne to the Pyrenean mountains, and to that part of the ocean which is near Spain. It looks between the setting of the sun and the northern star. So you could consider this as just a scientific, historical, withdrawn, third-person commentary, but I think it's slightly more advanced than that in that he's doing both. It's as if all of the host of heaven, with its myriads of stars and its towering snow-capped mountains, faced inward to these activities of the hero, the protagonist, in his own tale, Julius Caesar, with all of his legions. So, that is a sufficient explanation of the tribes, the general voice of the commentaries, and Caesar's position. He's leaving Rome, having been the consul, I believe, at this point, and he's heading north. And while he's up there, he kind of begins looking for trouble. But to summarize, the use of tone, his unbiased perspective as a historian, simply using the genre of history, manufactures his rhetorical effect. So what happens is he's sitting in the northern parts of Italy, across the Alps, and he hears word that the Helvetii have burnt all of their villages and are heading through the province, or at least they have asked permission to do such. So they ask Caesar for permission to move through the province to get to a certain location to make war on another tribe. Caesar says, "Please wait. I will do some looking into this and get back with you." He does this and he goes back to the Helvetii and he says, "Sorry, not going to happen." But in this time, he has successfully made some preparations for battle and for war. And this is what he writes of what the Helvetii are doing, because they say, "Hey, okay, we can't go through the province. Can we go north of your border, cross the river at this point, and enter the enemy territory from this area?" And he says, quote, "If this took place, he saw that it would be attended with great danger to the province to have warlike men, enemies of the Roman people, bordering upon an open and very fertile tract of country." So they're bordering, but you can already see that he's preparing his audience, his readers, for the idea that this is not a war that is prosecuted lightly. It's not a war that he prosecuted for no reason, because the Roman people are in danger, supposedly, and the Helvetii are trying to move in an area close to the Roman province's border, and we can't allow that. So, he also continues and says, quote, "We ought to remember both the ancient disgrace of the Roman people and the characteristic valor of the Helvetii. So for one, who's to prevent them from running over into our territory on their way around our territory? And for two, there was a consul who was killed in battle against the Helvetii, and some very harsh words are minced between the Helvetii and Caesar at one point. So things begin heading towards battle. Caesar finds a third of the train of the Helvetii not yet crossing the river at the point at which they declared they would do so. He puts them to the sword. And this begins the campaign in earnest. It's less of a campaign and more of a battle to attempt to bring the Helvetii under the submission of Caesarean rule. But what's interesting is how he paints all of the preparation towards this with all of the failures and things of that nature. Something that could be listed as a lack of logistical forethought, Caesar portrays as just the stroke of fate when he says, quote, "There was not in store a sufficiently large quantity of fodder. Besides, he was unable to use the corn which was conveyed in ships up the river Saône, because of the Helvetii, from whom he was unwilling to retire. They had diverted their march from the Saône." So, you could say this, okay, Caesar, why did you not prepare enough wagons in your train so you could follow and keep all of your corn and keep it close to your army? But instead, he portrays it as he wants to not let the Helvetii escape. So it's all the way you spin it. So in continuing, let's just consider the fact that he's writing all of this. That right away gives us a clue as to his audience. Not many people were literate. Not as many as are today, obviously. That right there is a narrowing of his audience. Second thing to keep in mind is his use of voice that we've already mentioned. He's narrowing his voice to those who consider themselves intellectual, those who consider themselves possibly even historians, and he's possibly hoping that he will gain some powerful friends in the Roman Republic and in the Roman Senate when he returns. So all of this can be seen as maneuvering in advance of going back to Rome to compete with the triumvirate, something that's possibly seen as inevitable. So think about the way he treats his rivals. So he says, quote, "This is when the campaign has begun and battle has been joined at Bibracte," which we'll discuss in a second. He says, quote, "Publius Considius, who is reputed to be very experienced in military affairs, and had been in the army of Lucius Sulla, and afterwards in that of Marcus Crassus, was sent forward with the scouts." So this is to find out where the Helvetii have holed up. And Publius goes forward, and he declares that a mountain is in possession of the enemy. Later, Caesar discovers this mountain, and it is said in his writing, quote, "Caesar learned through spies that the mountain was in possession of his own men, and that the Helvetii had moved their camp, and that Considius, struck with fear, had reported to him as seen that which he had not seen." And the thing to realize here is there's no way of knowing if the situation changed in between Publius's report and Caesar's discovery of the mountain. There's no way of knowing if some contingent of the army did not take it, or if his own men didn't give him false information, but rather he accepts it outright and puts us in a situation of Publius's word against Caesar's word, which is an interesting thing when you consider the background of Considius and how much he'd done in multiple armies, and obviously had not yet been disgraced, but he's somehow disgraced in this small way. So, very interesting things. Another thing to consider in the portrayal of his characters is that after the battle, he portrays it this way. He requests the Helvetii and the other tribes who joined with them to do a certain service, and they do this. And they throw themselves in tears at Caesar's feet. That's actually a theme. That comes up again and again, almost like a poetic motif or refrain. And Caesar said this, and they threw themselves on the ground in tears. Divitiacus, a brother of one of the Gallic rebels, also approaches and says, "Hey, please don't kill my brother." And he falls on his feet before Caesar in tears. So all of this leads one to consider, is he portraying his characters accurately, or is he portraying them in a way that makes the protagonist, Caesar, look favorable? All very intriguing stuff. And then last of all, consider what is left unsaid. In this quote, if he had portrayed this the way it was actually going down, he might have offended some of the genteel sensibilities of the patrician class in Rome. Because even though they're all about military vigor, hearing of the rout and ruin of an enemy is not something that is pleasing to read about. So, the Helvetii approach in phalanx at the Battle of Bibracte. The Romans throw their javelins, and the phalanx breaks at that, supposedly. And then Caesar describes the retreat at this point as relatively orderly. But then we hear that apparently all through the night, soon after this, the battle goes on in the baggage of the Helvetii for most of the night. One doesn't have to think very deeply about what is not said here. Who stays with the baggage? Well, the unmustered stragglings of the Helvetii, such as the women, children, and the goods of the tribe. So rapine and depredation befalls them, but he does not bring this up. And we hear later on that after the battle, quote, "The Helvetii are compelled by the want of everything and send ambassadors to Caesar about surrender," unquote. So we know that something terrible happened in the baggage of the Helvetii's immigration movement, and that quite possibly the defeat was complete and total, except for some stragglings. So, all of this said and done, the treatment of the protagonist is the main thing in Caesar's rhetoric, and it's a very advanced rhetoric. He's appealing to the most intellectual members of Rome. His creation of place is historical, appears unbiased, and the plugs that he puts in for himself are not necessarily outright. So the positive perspective in this is that rhetoric can go on many, many levels. And the real question we have to ask is, at what point does rhetoric become outright lies? I don't really have answers for that as of yet. But that suffices for my positive perspective on Caesarean rhetoric, and I hope that you find it worthwhile as we continue to consider trivium, the delight in thought, and logos in the coming days.